Welcome everyone to this final session of the live streaming days on Helix 21. I think it's always a great place to finish is be thinking about investment and money. And we've been building towards it for a day and a half now. So I'm delighted, the topic we have in terms of unicorns and M&A, and how do we create them in an ecosystem like we have, then I think is a very apt place to be rounding out the session rather. So without any more from me, from a One Nucleus perspective, I'd like to welcome everybody and particularly introduce you to Alexandra Black from MedCity, who very kindly researched and penned an article for our annual review this year on this very topic. And it was sufficiently interested in the readership that we had. It felt like it was the right discussion to bring to on Helix. So Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and welcome to you all. And hello to all our panelists. And it would be great if we can take a few minutes for you all just to introduce yourselves. So I'll just work around on my gallery view, starting with Eliot Forster, CEO of F-Star Therapeutics.
Yeah, Alexandra, and thanks to you and Tony and the team for the invitation to speak today. So I'm Eliot Forster. I'm CEO at F-Star Therapeutics, Nasdaq listed immuno-oncology company working in the next-gen bispecific space. I'm also chairman of the board of an AIM-listed company called Avacta PLC, also immuno-oncology and diagnostics space. And I guess finally, a non-executive director for another Nasdaq-listed oncology company called Immatics. Nice to speak with you today, Alexandra.
Lovely, thank you. And Sally-Ann Forsyth, who heads up the Stevenage Biocatalyst.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to the team, and thank you very much to the audience for inviting me along this afternoon. Delighted to have an opportunity to speak with everyone. I'm Sally-Ann Forsyth. I'm Chief Executive of Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst. We're based on the GSK campus. We're founded back in 2012 with funding from GSK, the Wellcome Trust, and government. We now have about 42 companies on the campus and have raised 1.8 billion since 2012, of which around 50% has been in IPO and the other 50% in equity. So looking forward to discussing this further this afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sally-Ann. And next to Michael Anstey from Cambridge Innovation Capital.
Thanks, Alexandra. Michael Anstey here, partner on the life sciences team at CIC. We are a venture capital fund that invests in IP-rich life sciences and tech companies that have a link to the Cambridge ecosystem. Our first fund is a £275 million fund, which we invested in 30 life sciences and tech companies, and we're now deploying capital out of our second fund.
Thank you very much, Michael. And next, Laura Segert from Ernst & Young.
Thanks, Alexandra. I'm Laura Segert. I'm a partner in our capital markets team here in London, and I focus on helping companies both reach the US listed status or help existing listed companies either on Nasdaq or NYSE with their ongoing reporting requirements, including SOX compliance, PCOB, and I play in both spaces where I'm on the audit side at times and on other times the advisory side.
Fantastic, thank you, Laura. And finally, Ross McNaughton from Taylor Wessing.
Thanks, Alexandra. So yes, I'm Ross McNaughton. I'm a partner in the corporate technology and life sciences team at Taylor Wessing. We're a law firm. We're based across the UK, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and North America. We do a lot of work in life sciences. Tech and life sciences are our core focuses. My practice in particular is a life science advisory practice, so helping companies as they spin out, look to do various seed rounds, Series A, B, C, etc., right through to M&A and or capital markets at the end of it.
Lovely, thank you very much, Ross. So that's all of us introduced. And so to begin with, just a little recap of why we're here. And that's, as Tony alluded earlier, the annual review had an article on exits and unicorns and the debate over whether, is it a bad thing that UK biotechs seemingly exit, before they've been able to reach a unicorn status? Is it a bad thing, or is it not so bad after all? So moving on from there to delve a bit deeper into the future of funding new medicines, especially in the post-Brexit, post-COVID, or not quite post-COVID, but certainly pandemic setting. I wanted to start by asking you, Eliot, as the CEO of F-Star Therapeutics, listed on Nasdaq, and with an HQ in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but with a research base in Baber Cambridge. Why did you choose that particular route to funding in the US, and what were some of the strategic steps that you took to get there?
Yeah, so I speak to you from our labs on the Baber Research Campus just outside of Cambridge, UK right now. I often joke with our investors that we're Cambridge squared. The route to Nasdaq for us was by the way of a RTO, so a reverse merger into an organization called Springbank Pharmaceuticals, and I'll come back to those guys in a second. We entered the beginning of last year being a presidential election year with awaiting some phase 1 data from our most advanced product and bringing 2 more programs into the clinic. And under normal circumstances on Nasdaq, that's a perfectly doable IPO, but doctrine would say that during an election year, you need to get out early or not at all and then just wait. So as a company, we waited, and in particular, just after JP Morgan, as the pandemic began to grow and become obvious out of China, we were doubly sure that to remain private until this year, 2021, was the right thing to do. And of course, we were 180 degrees wrong. It's been an extraordinary year for capital raising, IPOs. I think by end of June, it had been just under $24 billion of new money going into biotech life sciences through Nasdaq. And so what a boom year. And so we had to act fast. We quickly ignited one of several pathways that are possible, but ultimately the winner in terms of time for us was the RTO with Springbank. And Springbank was particularly interesting to us because it had 3 good things. I'm setting aside the team who are very professional all the way through to the completion of the merger. They had a really interesting 2nd generation immune oncology asset already in the clinic. So that would add to our portfolio. And indeed, we now have 4 programs in the clinic in IO, which is really exciting. They had cash, and they also had, of course, a Nasdaq listing. And so we used that as the vehicle to reverse into, and we listed as F-Star Therapeutics Inc. For the first time on the 23rd of November. One of the differences about going that route rather than through a typical IPO F1 is that you're immediately a US registered company. So there's no grace period getting SOX compliant and all of the other bits and pieces. So we had to jump straight into that. But it worked very well for us. Our share price is more than doubled since that time. We've also raised close to $90 million through Nasdaq, and so it's touch wood been a good process so far. It was quite quick, which is what we'd intended, and we managed to ride the biotech enthusiasm that has been, I guess, catalyzed by the need for treatments, for preventions, for vaccines, for COVID, and the just general global interest. Why Nasdaq was the second question, and the reason we were interested is that we are operating in a highly competitive space. There are many bispecific molecule companies. We were in the clinic, so we needed not single-digit millions, but tens of millions in order to move those forwards. And we needed investors who were sophisticated enough to understand the clear differentiation of the F-Star platform compared to other bispecific platforms. And that really does require a level of molecular understanding of immune oncology pathways in order to see those differences. And for us, the level of capital, that sophistication made the inconvenience really pale into insignificance.
Thanks very much, Eliot. So actually that raises an interesting point, which I wanted to address to you, Laura, with your expertise in helping companies list in the US. So the reverse merger, like the one that Eliot's outlined there, is one way. But the less traditional kind of SPAC model is now seeing a boom in the US. What, from your perspective, what is the big appeal of SPACs, and from the perspective of a life sciences company wanting to grow and potentially considering the Nasdaq, why would they consider a SPAC, and under what circumstances would that be the best choice?
Sure, and in some ways what Eliot was speaking of resonates here as well, that often it's the cash that's available and already raised, and two, a SPAC is already a listed entity. So the appeal is more the speed that you can become a listed entity quicker under a SPAC arrangement than going through a traditional IPO. So the SPAC will raise the funds, but what you don't need to go through is kind of the roadshow, finding the interest in the investors yourself. That investor group has already come together. They formed this entity that then is going to go out and acquire one, if not more entities strategically through the SPAC that they've created, and the cash is already there. So you're not going through the traditional IPO timeline where there's specific file. There are filings you need to do, but initial filings with the SEC, review comment period, and then a roadshow. That roadshow bit falls away, because once you do the required filings, the merger takes place, you're a merged entity, that cash is part of now the company that you're part of. There's a debate on whether or not it's necessarily cheaper. I think all situations are different as far as what's required to complete the SPAC versus a traditional IPO in each situation. So I think time will tell if actually it does become cheaper. But again, it's typically a quicker way to achieve and become a listed entity in the United States.
Sorry, I should have asked you if you could explain to us what the SPAC model is.
Sure. So a SPAC is a special purpose acquisition company. So typically it's where investors come together, do a fundraise where cash is raised, and it's almost a shell entity. So they're listing a public company with the intent to do acquisitions, and oftentimes it is in a certain sector, and the life science biotech sector is rich for these type of companies, because they are companies that have the need for fundraising as well. So they set up a shell company that does not have operations, take that company public with the intent within a certain period of time, typically you see 18 to 24 months, to then go do an acquisition whereby the cash that was previously raised upon the listing of the SPAC is then used in the operations of the acquired entity. So in some ways, what the filings that are required through a SPAC look a little similar to what Eliot described as the F1 process, or the RTO, the reversed acquisition that he went through. A lot of the information is the same. It just, the look might be a bit different, and some of the registration statements that get filed with the SEC are called different things, but ultimately you are being acquired by an existing listed entity and become listed upon the merger.
And do you have any examples within your, the companies that you've helped that have chosen to go the SPAC route?
Interesting enough, Alexander, what I'm seeing now are companies are dual tracking. So they say, look, if a SPAC comes along that makes sense for me to merge with, we have a similar, similar idea of what we want the merged entity to look like, the timing's right, we will go with that SPAC. But on the same time, we're going to dual track the traditional IPO process as well. And right now I'm working with a few in confidential status where they are going down the traditional route. But again, if a SPAC comes along that makes sense for them to merge with, they will absolutely entertain it. I had 3 dual tracks go this year, but ended up all going into the traditional route, interestingly enough, for one reason or another.
Great, thank you. And Eliot, I wanted to ask you, as the chair of Avacta, which is a biotech listed here in London on the AIM, you obviously also have experience of going through a listing in the UK, which is the route also taken by Abcam, who chose to list on AIM, and now Oxford Nanopore are seen to list in London. In what circumstances do you think a UK listing is viable for biotech wanting to grow?
Yeah, so I mean, there are distinctions between the 3 companies that you've mentioned. So Avacta, Abcam, and Nanopore, in the sense that they are either much closer to a revenue, and therefore in a management accounting sort of way, it's much easier to see a way to a profit, and therefore the investors that are typically making up UK investors are more familiar with that. I mean, the kind of P&L model for the sorts of companies that Michael invests in and I'm running and the other guys support are, the P is actually promise and loss. So it's like promise and loss for biotechs generally, and not profit and loss. And the UK tend to invest in more traditional companies that are much more likely to have a sales line. It doesn't mean that others haven't been successful. And of course, GW Pharma recently acquired, started in the UK in AIM and dual listed and then were acquired. And there are several examples of that. But it is really that the risk profile, the risk tolerability, and I think also for the most part, the sophistication of the investors is not geared up with respect to understanding the kind of fundamentals of science to support listings of really basic science type of companies. And so I think that's one of the distinctions. I think the other piece is that each of the entities also have a what's the right description? Kind of we love the UK sponsor sitting behind it. And you can look to, Abcam and its origins, Nanopore and, the work it's been doing with the UK government recently and its origins, and a long time ago, Avacta in a similar sort of way. So there needs to be, I think, that closeness to revenue and that determination to remain a UK listed company.
Great, thanks. So Ross, you also have experience of companies listing on both sides of the Atlantic, US and UK. Are there any particular trends you're seeing in terms of companies on, going either way?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe starting with AIM, and I totally agree with all the comments that Eliot made in terms of you need to be the right type of company to get onto AIM, and there's a particular there's a particular demographic to it, right? So if you're a sort of single candidate oncology company, phase 1 looking to raise money for phase 2, that's not really the type of model that they're looking for. And so the kind of companies that are looking to go onto AIM or that have gone onto AIM tend to be ones, as Eliot said, that have kind of some sort of revenue model. Even Aracor, which listed about a month ago, that has a revenue licensing model, which is another Cambridge-based company. What we are seeing, which is really interesting, is an increasing trend of US companies coming to list in London, and what they're doing is so in terms of the UK market, there's definitely from an investor perspective, there's definitely an appetite for life sciences. As Eliot was saying, the investor the degree of investor specialism is more acute in New York than it is here in London, which is more geared towards generalist investors. So if you're a company that, probably doesn't carry too much or any FDA risk, and, perhaps a medtech company that's looking to, it's got your FDA approval and you're looking to scale and grow revenues, that could be a really interesting option. Their name could be a really interesting option. And what we're seeing quite a lot of is US companies that are too small to go onto Nasdaq, that are looking to exploit the delta between what the capital markets there can offer and what what growth companies need, without having to go to traditional venture financing options. They're coming to AIM as effectively an alternative to to a sort of Series B or C, and so you're seeing companies that are raising the likes of sort of anywhere between sort of 15 to 50 million, with somewhere around a sort of 50 to 150 market cap, which is again way too small for Nasdaq right now. So which is actually really interesting. And yeah, I mean, in terms of going the other way from the UK to the US, it remains the case that a lot of life sciences companies are looking at Nasdaq, and it's definitely a trend, right? And the depth of capital there, the level of investor knowledge, as we were talking about, is all the kind of a pull factor for them. Again, it's not for everyone, but it's certainly something that a lot of people are looking at. Alexandra, you're still on mute there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Classic mistake. Just thinking about the US companies coming to list in the UK, what steps do they have to go through to do that? And is that any different from a UK company going to?
Not really, no. So I mean, for those companies, AIM is very flexible. So some of them, like I don't know, Polarian, Bellascura, they will insert a top co in the UK, but not all of them will. So one we're working on right now, they've got a US top co, and they're just going to list the US top co directly. It helps with the marketing message, to be honest, if there's some sort of US nexus, and certainly if the overseas company wants to get EIS and VCT eligibility, they need to have some form of permanent establishment. But it's a pretty flexible process. So which is one of the attractions for these companies, because it also then sets them up to the extent they want to go over to Nasdaq in a couple of years' time, once they've used AIM as a stepping stone to get to the next stage of their growth.
Great, thank you, Ross. And Sally-Ann, I wanted to turn to you now. At the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst, you've developed an incredibly successful model for helping biotechs in cell and gene therapies to really flourish. So can you tell us a bit about this model and explain why it's been so effective at growing companies?
Great. Thanks, Alex. Well, I guess our focus has been about creating that ecosystem for growth. And really, we look at it in two ways. First thing is we bring that innovation supply chain together. So right from the academic outstanding research base as a fundamental research, we bring them together with startups that try out to translate that base, and then put them together with the major corporates who actually understand how to get the route to market. And then around that innovation supply chain, we put a supportive environment, and that's all to do with giving the companies the things they need at the right time. So early stage and late stage access to specialist facilities. And then it's training and mentoring and skills for the team, for they've got the right employees. And then it's access to finance. So we bring those three elements around it. If you think of the phases of technology, so initially small molecules, now very well known, the supply chain there and the route to market. The same for antibody technology, for example, has now come through. But for cell and gene technology, that's still emerging. And actually the supply chain, and particularly the manufacturing, isn't terribly well known there. So it's been really important to us and a huge asset to have the cell and gene manufacturing catapult center on campus. And that allows the little fledgling companies and even the larger companies to actually develop their manufacturing processes, which is where they actually generate a lot of IP. And that they can make trial samples that they can get out to trials and get results. Now, they couldn't do that themselves without access to this shared facility. So what we found is getting access to the right facilities, the skilled people and the finance, all at the right time at each stage of growth, that's really helped them to generate results, and results equal more investment, and that's helped them to grow.
And what sources of investment are your companies, typically finding success sourcing?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have over 30 different investors. Of course, it varies depending what stage they're at. For cell and gene use, Syncona has been, of course, particularly important. As I mentioned, I think right at the beginning, our companies have raised about 1.8 billion, and about 65% of that's been in cell and gene technologies. And sort of 50-50, as I said, grant and equity, and the other 50% IPO, FPO, and exit. And to put it in proportion again, about 75% of that has been raised in the US, if we go across the board. Now, though we've got quite a large cluster of cell and gene companies, of those, only some are raising money, and so of them, about 9 companies are raising investment, and our 4 biggest ones have got investment from Syncona, and they're really big companies. As you may know, Syncona was spun out of the Wellcome Trust, and it's actually got a very large capital pool. Last time I looked, it was about 580 million. So because of their origins and because of this deep pool of capital that they have, they can really take a long-term view, and that's really helped our companies. So what they do is they identify key technologies, they add a very, very good management team to that, but then they follow and continue to invest and bring in others later on, those companies right the way up through to market, which is still pretty unusual. And by the time they get to market, they also want to be a significant shareholder. So at the point of sort of product approval market. So so far, and it's still, I guess, fairly early stages, but it's been proved to be a very successful model.
And Sally, have you also seen interest from overseas companies, companies that want to come and be in the UK, particularly located with you where you are?
We have. I mean, I think it's just being able to bring the supply chain together and develop the manufacturing, particularly for cell and gene. So we've got companies from Spain, the US, elsewhere, that have said they've looked around the world. This is my famous quote, I've looked around the world and I wanted to come to SBC at Stevenage. And it's because we've got that supply chain and that ecosystem and that skill pool of people at different stages within cell and gene. And that's perhaps one of the most intensive clusters that there is in the world in cell and gene. And that's been a big attractor to people.
Great, thanks, Sally Ann. And Mike, I'd love to bring you into the conversation now. Thank you. You've been sitting there very patiently waiting. I wondered if you could firstly just give us a little bit of the background to Cambridge Innovation Capital, the size of the fund. You've mentioned that there's a second one now that is growing, and what your model has been for funding long-term company growth, because I understand that's really where your focus is on companies that from the outset express a desire to sort of really go for long-term growth and become the unicorns of the future.
Yes, thanks, Alexandra. So CIC was set up, as you say, to fill a funding gap. We can use the Cambridge ecosystem as an example, but I think this applies broadly to the UK and other ecosystems. And Cambridge specifically has been a great success because of angel investors who were often successful entrepreneurs giving back and helping with cash and mentoring and creating lots of companies around Cambridge. Same thing happened in Oxford, same thing happened in London. But the gap existed sort of post this angel round and what to do with sort of classic Series A and Series B funding. And so CIC was set up to be able to follow on from early stage investments to provide growth capital and get companies through that earlier stage into proof of concept in a biotech world, into the clinic, and be able to accelerate some growth. And so CIC has been doing that since 2014 through 30 companies. And as I listen to the panel speak, it's really exciting to hear how the UK ecosystem has evolved over time. It's clear the funding gap is certainly not the angel stage. That was solved a number of years ago. I think Series A and Series B is also solved right now. And there's really this question mark on how do you deal with extreme growth when you want to go and raise $50, $100 million. And in parallel, there's an interesting thing happening, which is sort of called non-linear growth right now, which is you don't necessarily go from C to A to B to C to cross over to IPO. It's non-linear, and the idea is you have a great idea, you want to attract a great team that requires, in the biotech space, 50 million Series A check, and even a much larger one right after that. And so how do we handle this non-linear growth? For us, what we have is we have a co-investment program, which is our LPs, so the investors in CIC rely on us to find great Series A, Series B opportunities. We're on the ground, we're seeing what's happening, and then they can follow on using our preemption rights to help grow the companies and raise those very large rounds. And we're seeing that with CMR, just raised $600 million recently. We listed Bicycle on the Nasdaq. So there's examples of where companies are coming through into maturity. And going back to where this conversation started, IPO is an important part of a funding strategy for a company. And the way we've been looking at it is not as an exit, but as a funding event. And so what we see as success is not get onto Nasdaq or get onto AIM or get onto the main market in London and then wait for the 180-day lockup period to end and then run. It's keep on going and go for growth. And Eliot and I have shared lots of notes about how that can work for UK companies to continue to grow and use public listings as a funding source. And Eliot, I wrote down the term, we love the UK sponsor needed. I think that's absolutely right. And to me, that's much more about making sure there's meaningful operations that persist in the UK, less so whether it's on AIM or Nasdaq or anywhere else. It's important to get the cash, but really, really important to maintain UK operations and leverage what we have here locally.
Thanks very much, Mike. And have you seen sort of examples of that happening during this past year?
Yeah, this year hasn't been a typical year, so hard to say sort of what's going to be mainstream now. But yes, there's lots of cash available right now, and I think the one good thing you could say about COVID is that it's made life sciences and the importance of life sciences on everyone's mind, and that's made non-specialist investors want to get into the space and work with special investors to supply capital. So I think that is a good outcome. Hopefully it continues, and I do think it will continue. There's certainly a bit of hype right now, which will cool down, but there's lots of evidence where this non-linear growth, so large amounts of cash upfront, is a very successful model. And I don't think it's just sort of wasted cash being thrown out the door. It's required to build big companies, hire great teams, and seek to have that ambition to build, multi-unicorn companies, not just get to $1 billion and then run.
And do you have any examples from within your portfolio of companies that have followed this the non-linear pattern?
Well, maybe I can give you sort of one classic example, which is Bicycle Therapeutics, which did follow a more linear growth trajectory and use the Nasdaq as a funding event, and that's been really successful. So they listed in May of 2019, and that's been a great journey for fundraising, for profile building, for accessing new pools of talent. So they have a headquarters in Cambridge, UK, and a subsidiary in Boston, and that's been fantastic. And Eliot's done it sort of almost reverse, but for the same principles of team, profile, access to capital. So I think a very, very good story there. In terms of other examples, I think there's a few. CMR is one that we just can't ignore, where they've raised $600 million, the largest medtech financing in European history, and that's on a company that is still at a relatively early stage of their development. The incumbent is a company called Intuitive, which is a $60 billion big US business. CMR is going to take them on head to head and compete in a very exciting space, and that requires huge amounts of capital to do so. And I think if successful, great for UK. Great,
thanks, Michael. So if we think that the pandemic year has really helped to focus sort of the generalist investors and help them to become more interested in life sciences, what else do you think needs to happen in the UK to continue to kind of inform investors and to give them the specialized knowledge that US investors, for example, seem to have?
So is that to me, Alexandra? Should I start with that?
It's actually to everyone, but yes, if you have an answer, that would be great.
Well, I think specifically in the UK, one thing that's been very good has been the change in the rules of UK pension funds to open up more capital. There's tons of evidence we can point to in the US and other regions where you get superior returns by having some asset allocation to illiquid, innovative investments. And so I don't think we need to prove that point. It's well understood. And the UK is behind the curve on allowing pension funds to access that. So that can only be good if done sensibly and done in collaboration with expert funds who can understand sort of how to channel that money. So I think that's a good step forward. I'll leave it to my colleagues to comment on others.
Well, actually, I was going to, Ross, you have some knowledge of the pension fund, proposed pension fund changes. Perhaps you'd like to comment there.
So I think you're referring to like the long-term asset fund that the Chancellor announced a couple of months ago. I mean, to be honest, it's not my specialist area of expertise. I can totally see what they're trying to do. Yeah, I mean, as Mike said, what they're trying to do is effectively, get these investors who, don't have capital that can just be locked up for, necessarily be locked up for 12 months, because obviously funds are typically structures closed-ended, and sort of bring them into, bring open-ended fund structures, to these pension funds, but where they have underlying, long-term, horizons. So whether it's, life sciences, technology, real estate, infrastructure. So again, I mean, it's definitely on the government's radar. It's pretty, I mean, the consultation is pretty new, so let's see where it goes. But yeah, I mean, as Michael said, if they can make it work, then the one thing that is, definitely needed is, more capital coming in to sort of fill that gap, as has been already sort of talked about on the call. There's, early stage financing is great, like, SEIS, EIS is, are hugely, beneficial, tax regimes to help early stage companies. Series A, Series B, there's a lot of financing there already, but, as soon as these companies look to raise kind of, 50, 100 million plus, then, naturally you see these overseas investors coming in as well, which is not a bad thing. By no means is that a bad thing, but, and of course, the UK has a real strength in innovation and a great brand internationally that can attract that type of investment. But if we can get more of that money into, UK fund managers' hands and get them access to longer term investments, then all the better.
Yeah, I think, Alexandra, if I might just add a couple of things to that. So in addition to the consultation that's going out, there was the February of this year Pension Scheme Act included direct contributions legislation, which was modified to allow pension funds to invest in illiquid stock. So biotechs would be a good example of that. And it mimics its follow-on. I think, and I may be wrong, but I think from Damon Buffini's recommendations from the Patient Capital Review from about 4 years ago, and it mimics the Prudent Man Act revocation in the mid-70s in the US, which basically did the same thing. So the pension funds, you can take a small percentage of your capital and put it into a liquid companies for growth purposes. That can happen in tech, and it really sort of kicked off venture capital as we know it today. And there are still one or two of those founding venture capitalists around who were there at that time. And I think the hope, I think to Michael's point, is that the trillions of pounds that are locked up in pension funds, a tiny fraction of that can really catalyze. I would say the timing is probably better now than it was when it was first conceived by Damon, in the sense that, at least in biotech, because of organizations like Syncona and the spin-outs that have come through, Cambridge, UCL and other places, investors in the UK have seen a return on that investment. And certainly 4 or 5 years ago, it was less easy to point at a return on the investment that had been made. Now that return has been made because companies have either exited. So my neighbor here, Kymab, or Ablinks would be another one with Ed Moses' company, or they've gone onto Nasdaq and they've been able to either stick and see a virtual growth in the value, or they've actually sold a little bit and got some return back, or entirely got their return back. And so if you bring together that freeing of the kind of handcuffs of the fund managers from the pensions with the fact that investors can see a way to make a return, and the fact that there is so much capital available, at least in the US, and more of that coming here, by the way, then I think the time is probably right. When I was working at MedCity, where you work, Alexandra, the Mayor of London at the time, with another professional services organization, not on the call here, did an analysis to look and see what the gap in funding was. And the gap in funding remains today exactly the one that Michael described, which is that kind of 50 to 100 million necessary to take the early clinical results and turn it into something which is confirmed. And hopefully the combination of this pensions change with a view to seeing a return on investment will fulfill that need for the UK. Because what is continuing to be true, and I'll shut up in a second, is that the ideas coming out of the UK continue to flourish. And if you go, if you look probably at Michael's diary, he'll be seeing dozens and dozens and dozens of brand new, fantastic ideas with entrepreneurs attached to them. And that's true in Cambridge, it's true in Oxford, across London, it's true right across the north of England. And so there's no shortage of ideas, and it's really that next step in capital that will make a difference. And hopefully, and look, and I'm a passionate Brit, and I would love for AIM or LSE to be the tech market that we go to. It doesn't happen quickly, but perhaps, with the continued big investments from Syncona and others that will be able to match that, and the funding coming from pensions, assuming that all gets played out, then we can begin to make the investment community more sophisticated, and options for companies like mine are then real. It's Nasdaq or the UK, and we can make a decision. Whereas right now it's tough with the exceptions that we've mentioned to justify to a board and investors staying here rather than going there.
Yeah, and I'd just like to agree with my colleagues here. It's more capital, longer term capital, specialist investors that show returns to encourage further investment. But on top of that, I guess the other things that we're actually closer to is also our companies retaining a base in the UK, and that they retain the research, which is the UK, as Eliot just said, is so well known for and highly respected, but they maintain that base, grow that base. Doesn't mean they won't grow elsewhere, because they have to, because the markets are elsewhere, and they may need to raise their money elsewhere, but keeping incentives for them to grow in the UK. And one of the other stumbling blocks we're seeing is our companies are growing so fast, they can't recruit fast enough. So we've got to have that tidal wave of people to come in to fill those companies. So there's a whole training, and that's not just early stage training, it's right the way through, and it will be people changing careers to change into other roles, so it'll be also lifelong learning, but we need to get that skill base up so that we are attractive to people to grow their businesses here, so we can fulfill those roles.
Thanks, Eliot. Actually, we've got a question in from one of the delegates, and that is, what's the biggest pinch point in the cell and gene space, in your opinion?
At the moment, it's manufacturing space, because the manufacturing is just going through the prototyping, and now people are going to the larger scale. So it's a pinch point there, and as I just mentioned, the skills base. There's going to be a real skill shortage because our companies are growing so fast.
And in terms of the investment, is there, where do the pinch points lie? Sort of at what point in the growth journey?
Yeah. To be honest, investment's been pretty good. As I say, 65% of the funding that's come in has come in for cell and gene. Our companies are in a lower risk environment because we have such a supportive environment for them. But it is that the pinch point is that jumping phase to just going from the prototyping, where it's just really expensive to do the prototyping and then get it to that next stage. So early stage is easier, but it's that longer term capital for that next very expensive phase where they've also got to do the manufacturing at the same time. I'd say that's where the major part is.
Great, thanks, Hellianne. And Laura, I just wanted to bring you in here to ask from your perspective in terms of the companies that you are helping to seek listing in the US. At what point are they coming to you, and what kind of challenges have they had, and perhaps any examples you have of that?
So the trend that I'm seeing in the most recent 12 months is they are coming at a much younger stage or much earlier stage these days. And if I think back to, when the pandemic was first starting, I thought, oh gosh, windows are going to close. We're not going to see much activity. And I couldn't have been more wrong. I've had more conversations in the last 12 months with companies who either want to accelerate their timeline to listing or say, listen, we feel we're behind the ball here. What do I need to do to start the prep to list? So I'm having more and more conversations with companies these days. I do sense a bit of a slowdown now, but I think that's coming back to more normalcy than what we saw for the first 6 months of this year. And I think, you're going to see a lot of activity continue into, the first half of next year. So a lot of my conversations are what do we need to do? What do we need to do to prep? What do I need to do to get us, a good registration statement out there so it can kick off the listing process? And that's probably a conversation I have multiple times a week.
And I mean, Alexandra, it's again, I agree with all of that, and it's not just in the capital markets that things have been extremely active. I mean, the US and the UK capital markets have been extremely busy for issuances right now, or in the last kind of 6 to 12 months. But that flows down right the way through. Sort of venture financings have never been busier, in my opinion. Spin outs within as many spin outs as we ever have seen. So the whole of the ecosystem, the sort of pipeline is just as healthy as it was, and of course M&A is busy as well. And so to be fair, that bodes pretty well. I mean, I think there's a lot of confidence right now, and I agree with Laura that things seem to be sort of slowing down slightly for the summer. But all the fundamentals right now are pretty solid, I think.
Yeah, and I guess if I might just add a couple of kind of observations. One is in terms of cell and gene therapy. So gene therapy, one of the bonuses, if you like, of a greater understanding of biotech, and in particular, the use of RNA technologies, is that gene therapies are hot, and I've heard anecdotally of multiple term sheets going into very, very early stage companies in the gene space. Cells continue to be, though there are more and more of those, and the level of sophistication required to compete in the cell space is growing, but that continues to be popular. But one of the things for everyone else, as it were, is it's sometimes easy to believe that, particularly sitting in the UK, because there are relatively few biotechs in any particular space, that you are the biotech. And it's a very useful exercise for entrepreneurs just to go and walk the streets of, Cambridge and Boston, not Cambridge here, but Cambridge there, and Boston, and just see how many companies there are, because that differentiation story, that equity story, needs to be really sharp, because you can pretty much imagine that there are 3 or 4 or 10 or 60 companies doing pretty much the same as your company is, not just one that happens to be on a campus somewhere and you're the best at it. And so that needs to be really sharp. And that's a solitary experience for those who've not been over to see what the competition looks like from here. And I think that's really important. And it remains the case, therefore, that for European companies, the hurdle through Spac, RTO, IPO is a little higher, because it's, we're over here, and it's very easy for a Boston-based or a New York-based or San Francisco-based investor to open her or his front door and have a dozen companies walk through that are 2 streets away, and all of that is very simple. So we've got to be really sharp with respect to our understanding of why our technology is different, what it's going to do for patients, and why it'll make a return on investment. And we can do it across where here, but it does need that. There's a little extra nudge up, that's required. I'd also, if just one more sentence, I'd also support Ross's contention that the private capital market is also similarly doing very well. If you don't look at issuance into companies, but look at how much private capital has been raised by funds over the last year to then in turn issue, and so we're in a pretty healthy environment. And to help with that is what we've all learned during the pandemic is you can fundraise like this. Still some human interactions are possible in 3 dimensions, but 2-dimensional interactions also work really, really well. And I guess all the way back to my opening comment, we did that RTO without physically meeting anyone from the other company. We just met them like this in 2 dimensions. And when you meet them for real, it's amazing how either large or small some of them turn out to be.
Great, thank you very much, Eliot. And actually, Ross, I wanted to ask you too about the proposed regulatory changes to the London Stock Exchange. For example, the dual class shares. I know there was some reporting at the weekend about Oxford Nanopore, particularly looking at a kind of golden share concept. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and how that could impact life science companies that are considering listing in London?
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, part of the consideration when a company is looking to go public in the UK versus the US is how much control the founder or founding team retains. And in the US, it's pretty well known that you can have a dual class of shares and that founders can keep hold of their voting rights effectively over and above the investors coming in. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook is like the obvious example, and his founder shares are there in perpetuity, and so he can sort of like vote down all the public markets investors, etc. Whereas in the UK, I mean, historically there has been some kind of there's been a handful of examples over the last maybe 100 years of companies who've had some form of dual class structure, but in the main it's not been done. There's primarily an issue around having a premium listing, so it's incompatible with a premium listing, and some listings recently, including the Huck Group last year, did it with a standard listing, and investors have seemed to be getting a bit more comfy with it. And then in the Hill review of the listing regime a couple of months ago, or the findings of which were published a couple of months ago, one of the recommendations there was that we should allow dual classes of shares to give founders or the founding team a particular entrenchment of rights for a defined period, to just give them that little nudge to be able to to think about using London and to put London effectively on an equal footing from a regulatory perspective to New York. And in all fairness, other exchanges around the world have also taken New York's lead and introduced dual class regimes as well. And then the Oxford Nanopore one was reported at the weekend. That's slightly different. So that's effectively a golden share was going to the founder, but it kind of does the same thing. And it's a way of getting the founder or giving the founder the ability to veto a takeover, which, to my mind, is worth stepping back actually. So the reason those rules don't, it's not, you're not allowed to have a golden share right now. I mean, there are examples of golden shares that the government had in strategic, listed companies like BAE and I think British Energy and those sorts of companies to stop them falling into the wrong hands sort of thing. But for those sorts of rights to go to a founder and or for dual class shares to go to a founder doesn't really sit very well historically with how corporate governance is set up for listed companies in the UK, which is on a comply or explain basis. So if investors don't like it, they can vote with their feet and sell their stock, and or if they really wanted to become activists and try and remove the board. And so by introducing these sorts of things, you're necessarily restricting those rights of investors. But I think it's coming, and I think the argument is that investors, aren't that comfy with it, then they can price it in or not take up the shares. And so it was definitely, as I said, it was a recommendation of the Hill Review, and I do think that I suspect that we'll see it feature, within the next sort of 12 to 24 months as a regulatory change.
Did anyone else have any views on the regulatory changes to the London Stock Exchange? So that leaves us just 5 minutes. So I wanted to quickly touch on Brexit, which we haven't mentioned, and how you think that has affected capital investment in life sciences in particular, in your experience. I know that there's been just generally speaking, there's a big influx of Swiss money coming in because of, they can finally come and trade in London post-Brexit. So, Michael, would you like to kind of start the comment on that? Yes, in the venture world, there's been relatively little impact from Brexit. There's still great sciences happening. There's still companies being created. There's still rounds getting away. The challenge, which I expect is the challenge we'll all face, is just making sure it is seamless for talent to come into the UK and help join our businesses. And that's because this is a highly competitive ecosystem. And why go to Cambridge versus Boston versus Shenzhen versus anywhere else? And so the easier we can make it for smart, hardworking people to come to the UK, the better. And Brexit is one step backward on that. And it's up to us to solve this. Yeah, the same for us, really. It's been recruitment for the companies has been the hardest thing. And also maintaining your current staff who may wish to grow or move or whatever. There's a little bit of an exodus before Brexit. So that on the company side, and then on a practical side, actually building buildings has actually had an effect because there's been supply chain issues for that side as well. So those are the two ways. But frankly, in the investment side, we've seen very little difference. Just to jump in from the kind of earlier stage side of things, because again, we have a life cycle advisory practice, so we see companies all the way through. The one thing I was worried about when the Brexit vote hit was just how that was going to impact on R&D within universities and PhDs coming over, etc. But again, in terms of ending on a positive note, that hasn't seemed to the level of science coming out of the universities is still second to none and coming through very strongly. So that's all very positive. It's all around the people issues, just to kind of reiterate what Michael and Sally were saying in terms of getting staff in once the companies are up and running. Thank you. So we've just got 2 minutes left. So I wondered if quickly each one of you wanted to tell our audience if you think the incredible growth in life sciences this year it will be sustainable, and what's one thing that we can do to ensure that the UK ecosystem remains a place for growing life sciences. Perhaps Sally Ann, would you like to comment? Yes, absolutely. It's going to be sector driven, and in some sectors but more, but yes, of course. And what's the biggest thing we can do? I think is shout about it. Make sure government's aware that what an asset we are to the UK. So that would be my advice, is to shout about success and help government to steer in for future growth. Fantastic. And Eliot?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, we've had since the Jobs Act in 2011 under the Obama government, there's been a bull run, couple of pauses, Hillary Clinton's email, etc. On Nasdaq. That drives the world economy. We've got to watch for inflationary pressures, which will then infect long-term bond yields, which would then distract some of the non-specialist money away. But all of the medium-term signals look like they're going in the right direction. And I think when the big four, as it were, who've made the vaccine start declaring their profits from that, then I think we'll see another uptick. And I think to Ross's point earlier, those big four plus others have got tons of cash, and M&A will take off. So I think we'll see the cycle continue to perpetuate, actually, certainly in the medium term. I advise everyone I know under 25 to come and work in the sector.
Thank you. And Laura, very quickly, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, not having such defined windows of where someone can access the market and maybe just have it be a bit more fluid, a little bit what Eliot was saying, I think will just continue to show that this is a sector that investors want to be part of. And to Sally's point, let's celebrate that.
Fantastic, thank you. Mike, we have 30 seconds for you?
Yeah, I'll make it quick so Ross can put his point in. We've seen such amazing ambition created by companies in the last 12 months, raise more, go faster, go bigger. Let's keep that going. Let's not have that quiet down. Let's keep this massive ambition moving forward to create fantastic and sustainable businesses in the UK.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Ross.
Well, I'm conscious we're getting messages here, so we need to wrap up. So I'll just finish by saying all of the above. I mean, yeah, look, it's been a phenomenal 12 months for the sector. It's obviously, in the forefront of the government's agenda to take the sector forward, so yeah, I think the future's pretty bright.
Well, thank you all. It's been a fantastic panel, and it's been a real pleasure to be chairing. And thank you to all our viewers. And I'll now hand the proceedings back to Tony.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for great chairing, and thanks to a great panel. I think that shared lots of food for thought. I think as well as excitement we have some challenges, and how do we make the UK PLC as good as it can be. I think over the last day and a half, we've heard the words around scale up a lot in terms of ecosystems, and finishing here with companies and capital pools. And I think the really positive things out of this is the recurring themes have been we have momentum, we have collaboration at a scale we've not seen before, and we don't lack ambition. And I think that's been shown over the last year of why we should be ambitious. And I'm sure with people on the panel we just had, as well as many others in the sector, I feel we're in pretty safe hands with the ambition factor, because I know you guys know you can do it. So thank you from all of us in the sector. I think to those of you driving those companies forward in the infrastructure. It's great to hear Anthony Brown, our MP in South Cambs, reinforcing yesterday how confident the government is in our sector. This is a major play, not just in our resilience, but in the economic recovery. I think all that bodes really well. So thank you for all the insights shared. I guess this is coming to the point where this was the last session of our live streamed keynote sessions over the last day or two. But fear not, if you're wondering, what am I going to do with my time now I've got no one Helix to go and watch? Then, as the saying goes, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. Well, I'm not a lady, and despite being Welsh, I can't sing either. So it can't be all over there for me. So over the next 3 days, we remain with some content around on Helix. We have some great innovation workshops lined up. The first one being at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. There's some on-demand content that's available for all to watch. And of course, the online networking can continue and more contacts made. So I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the week as well as the day and a half we've had so far. A few thanks from me really is to all of the speakers and panelists that we've had over the sessions. I think there's been some wonderful thought put into these panel discussions clearly in advance, and how people have responded to that conversation. Thanks to our sponsors on Helix, because without them we can't run these things. So a sincere thanks to those. And to the delegates, because no conference works and no panels work without an audience. So I can't wait to be back face-to-face in events, but actually I've thoroughly enjoyed the last day and a half. I think it's brought an awful lot of good stuff forward. And last but not least, thanks to the One Nucleus team of colleagues I lead. They work really, really hard. And I know everyone appreciates it because they feed it back, but for me, it's also a pleasure to lead that team and be doing jobs like this. So I'll finish on a note of thank you to them. I hope we'll see you all soon, and take care. Thank you.